I welcome everyone. Another very exciting session taken by a MSR veteran. The title, the session is Measuring the Unmeasurable. And this um, session will explore possible ways of measuring mystical experiences besides self-measurement scales such as Likert scales. Now, Jerry says that he doesn't have all the answers, but this would be a brainstorming session asking participants what they come up or what they have tried. Now, may I now introduce Jerry Biberman. I don't think he requires an introduction, but for the formality, let me do that. He's I mean, founding and leading edge writer. He's a researcher and speaker in the field of spirituality at work and has been involved in teaching and exploring the intersection of spirituality, leadership, and management. His early work in the area of spirituality at work helped to shape the field. He is Professor Emeritus of Management at the University of Scranton, and he's written and co-authored several books, invited articles, and book chapters on the topic. Jerry was the first co-editor of JMSR, the Journal of Management, Spirituality, and Religion. He was the founder and first chair of MSR Division of Academy of Management. He is currently chair of the Flamekeepers of that division. So, Jerry, I really invite you. You can please start your session. Thank you.
Thank you, and thank you for reading exactly what I wrote. And so, anyway, so welcome to the session, and there's about 10 people here. And as Addie said, what I'd really like this to be is kind of a brainstorming session, the kinds of things that you have done or you have tried. I also came up with some PowerPoints. I hate using PowerPoints, but I went on Copilot and I said, look, I'm giving this session, and they asked me for PowerPoints, so what do you think? And within 5 minutes, it gave me these PowerPoints. So when I show you these PowerPoints, you have to realize that these were generated by Copilot, but they almost sound like what I wanted to do. I mean, they sound like what I wanted to say. Okay, so I'm going to put them up at some point because we just spent a few minutes and they were explaining me how to do it. So, Adi, you said you want to, Adi, put up the thing just so we'll see the first one.
Okay.
Or maybe I'll try doing it. Let me see.
No, I'm doing it. I'm doing it.
Oh, you're going to do it. Okay, go ahead. Put up the first one. All it says is the session title, but that way you'll see. And while we're waiting for him to do that, here it is. Let's see. You see? Measuring mystical experience beyond self-report skills. Alternate research methods across different domains. My first question for you, because again, I'm going to ask a bunch of questions and ask you to hear what you think. Why do you think I don't like self-report skills? What's wrong with using self-report skills? Anyone want to throw it in or say something?
Yeah, they're biased.
What'd you say?
They're biased.
They're biased? Okay.
Yeah.
Yeah.
People don't tell the truth.
Oh, okay. Well, that's true. Well, in some cases, well, there's a couple of things. First of all, self-report scales, they might not tell the truth. Also, the way the scales are written, you can kind of, depending on, especially a Likert scale, where it's going from like 1 to 5 or 5 to 1, you can kind of put the scale in such a way that you almost like influence the results. There are some scales that have been validated more than other scales. Actually, for those of you who were at the last session that Kathy Lundeen did, her last two slides were pretty much what I was going to talk about in this session. How many of you were in the last session with Kathy? If you were there, I can't see anything, so I can't see who's there. But if you were there, she was talking about some of this. Jan, you raised your hand. You want to say something?
No, I attended the last session.
Oh, thank you. Okay. Yeah, who else was at the last session? Who
Partially, partially.
Constantine was there. Let's see, who's at this session? I can find out by looking over here, right? Okay. All right. Um, all right. So let's move on to the next. How do you move it on to the next one? Okay, why self-report scales are not enough. So you can see here, first one, the counts are shaped by interpretation. The first one is kind of what Constantine was just saying, you know. But then you have other things. Ineffability problem where resistant coding because of the nature of the states. They they're highly similar scales which might mask different profiles, and participants respond to perceived expectations. All right. And again, this is what some of you were saying. Also, even more important than that is that there are just some things that you can't put into words. What do you do with a, if you remember those of you who were at the morning session, the first session, where people were talking about this was an intense experience and things just became clearer, you know. And if you've had one of these experiences, um, it's very hard to put that into words. And that, you know, putting it into a self-report scale is almost like trivializing the experience. Okay, let's move on to the next one. But here's a list of some of the scales that have been used, the different questionnaires that have been used. And you'll notice if you look at the list that Kathy Lundin, I think, had about half of these on her list. And so these are instruments that are out there and have been, you know, validated. And you know, usually when you validate a scale, it's reliability and validity. And on the right, you can see some of the limitations: language dependent, cross-cultural validity gaps. And I was saying only what you can articulate. There's no real depth. You can confuse a state with a trait. And this last one, low sensitivity to sub-threshold experience. So again, you're talking about things that are so deep that the question won't get to that. Um, I wanted to say something about the difference between a state and a trait. Uh, Sometimes you see people, you know, they'll come back. I went to several workshop or several experiences with Joe Dispenza, and you know, he uses a lot of music, and while you're there, it's very powerful. And I was talking to people there and asking them, like, you know, how many times you've been to these things? And people have said they've been there like 10 times, 20 times. And what I think happens is they go there, and when they're there, they're in this state of euphoria, but it goes away when they go home. So there's a difference between mentioning something that just happens like once as opposed to something that's like turns into a permanent thing. And so I think the things that he was talking about in the first session, these are kind of the transpersonal experiences that stay with you, um, as opposed to going to like a Tony Robbins workshop or one of these other things where you get all excited while you're there, but then it kind of goes away later. And so these are some of the limitations with using just these kind of self report things. And I want to ask those of you who are here, can anyone think of any other things, other limitations of just using self-report like that? Anyone? Okay. Um, Also, I want to mention these scales, most of these are just kind of scales. Now, you know, as opposed to these, you can also have people writing essays. But even when they're writing essays, it's hard to put into words sometimes what the experience was like. Okay, so let's move on to the next PowerPoint. Howdy.
Yes.
Next one. Okay, and now we look at, if you look at this multi-method research architecture, and remember what Kathy Lendine was talking about? First thing she had on her slide was multi-method. And then she talked about neuroimaging and psychophysiological measures and behavioral and cognitive measures and, longitudinal biomarkers. So this is pretty much an overlap of what she was talking about. And the thing is that these kinds of architectures come from other fields besides what we're used to. Um, most of us, at least in the Academy of Management, um, the Academy of Management, it seems to me, I know we're recording this, but they kind of model themselves after the American Psychological Association. If you look at the way like journals are structured and everything else, use the same format and stuff. And the American Psychological Association has pretty much for years been a very positivistic, you know, very positivistic, looking at um, you know, things that you can observe, observable behaviors. But psychology was not always like that. In the early days of psychology, it was more introspection. So if you look at, like Freud and Freud's followers, like Jung was really into mythology. If you look at Wilhelm Reich, and he was like the kind of the predecessor, what turned into bio, um, um, you know, um, looking at energy work. And also, at the time, most of Western psychology didn't seem to know anything about other approaches from other parts of the world, like the Indian approaches. So now, of course, it's only been within, recent years that people have more of an understanding of other cultures and the way they measure these kinds of things. Also, and Kathy mentioned this, she mentioned several different types of studies she mentioned nursing and soldiering and social work. There's also years of research and writing in anthropology, years of research and writing in in religion. So you have all these various, ways of gathering data that um, basically move way beyond the positivistic, just looking at behaviors. I think when I went into, so I started off in psychology, and I think a lot of people started in psychology because, when they were undergraduates, they figured, oh, I have, some issue, and maybe studying psychology will help me with my issue. And then the very first thing that we were taught in psychology was that psychology is the science of behavior. And then we spent months studying rats running around in cages and Thorndike stuff and kind of almost nothing on introspection and what are people thinking. And this influenced a lot of people for a lot of years. And it's only been within the last like 10, 20 years that psychology has kind of changed to look more into more things besides just, like looking at, um, just behavior. So there's a wealth of other types of research that's been done, and I've been arguing for this for the last 20 years or so. Every, so many years, somebody would ask me, okay, where should we go now in MSR? And I would say, well, there's too much emphasis on, you know, uh, self-reports. We need to look at other things. And for years, the only people that were doing anything were the people at Maharishi University. They were studying TM. And so they were studying transcendental meditation, and they were calling their studies of meditation. And, there's other kinds of meditation besides transcendental meditation. So that's one thing. But they were the only ones they were kind of very early on doing some of these similar multi-method approaches that we now see. Okay, can you move on to the next one? Okay, so now I just kind of it mentions different ones. This first one is their neuroimaging, and so you can look at this and you can see um, there's entropic beams, spectral signatures. There's psychedelic, psychedelic neuroimaging. Yeah, all the stuff that he was talking about this morning, where he went in injecting things into the brain and looking at the brain patterns. Okay, look at the next one. You have psychophysiological measures, heart rate, respiration, galvanic skin response, pupils, and ocular motor measures. Okay, and now the next one, behavioral and cognitive markers. And so you can see them on here. Attention performance tests, working memory, pro-social behavioral indices, temporal perception tests, and a whole bunch of other ones. These are just some examples. Okay, next one. Linguistic and narrative analysis. Okay, and you can see some examples there. Phenomenology interviews, language processing, verbal immediacy, cross-cultural analysis. Okay, next one. And then longitudinal experience sampling methods. So we have some of them there. Experience sampling, structural daily diaries, well-being trajectories, intensive longitudinal methods. I think Kathy mentioned a few of these in her talk. Okay, move on to the next one. And then here's biomarker and biochemical methods. And so you can read these. So, I mean, the main point here is that there's a lot of other things you could do besides just self-report. Okay, next one. Computational and network science approaches. I like the first one, graph the brain network analysis, where you look at that's actually what he was talking about this morning. Agent-based coding models, machine learning classification. Um, I see Anil just came on recently, and I know Anil's very much into the AI stuff. And in fact, Anil and I wrote an article together on can AR, um, can artificial intelligence achieve higher levels of consciousness? So, um, so those are some of those approaches. Now go ahead to the next one, Anil. Adi. So then this is like, what are some ways that you could do a multi-method research program? So you could have these different measures and like was said, you could combine some of these methods together. Um, okay, go on to the next one. Okay, and what I have here is some questions. Which of these best maps into your own research? Um, what ethical obligations arise? How should cross-cultural validity inform our choice of measurement method? If machine learning achieves 90% accuracy, does that change the status of the experience? And these are just some of the questions. I guess go on to the next one. The next thing. Okay, and what I really wanted to to talk about here or to get to is once you have your research, the next question becomes where to publish it. And again, Kathy talked about some of this in our last session. If you have, where my own personal feeling is there's a home for every publication. But I think people don't realize where to publish, how to get the thing published, those kinds of questions. And she actually mentioned in the last session, it's a very important thing, which is don't just send your paper into a journal. First, tell the editor, I have this paper and here's why I'm submitting it to you. And before you even do that, take a look at the papers, the other kinds of papers in that journal and see if they're even interested in what you're writing. A lot of these journals, at least in the past, would look at a lot of this stuff and think it's very strange. So it's unless you explain what you're doing and why you're doing it, and then see if it fits in with what they're doing, they might not really understand where you're going with this. I mean, even before that, you might have this problem when you're just starting off, like working on a dissertation, convincing your committee that you're interested in this kind of stuff. But I think things are changing, so more and more it's more acceptable now than it used to be, but it definitely helps to explain why you're submitting to that particular journal. Okay, so that's a quick run. Now you can take off my PowerPoints. So, and now put on so we could see everybody. How does that work? Okay. Well, isn't there a way you put everybody on instead of just this is it. The gallery. Okay. So here we have everybody who's here, or at least whose cameras off. At least they say they're here. I don't know if they're actually. But anyway, so having said that, I would really like now to just have a discussion and see where we go with this stuff. I have one comment to make about publishing. Especially schools that are AACSB, they all want you to publish in a top tier journal. And as Kathy Landine said in the previous session, editors get hundreds of submissions for top tier journals. And how do you become a top tier journal? By only accepting like 3% of the submissions. So what does that mean? What happens to all the other papers that don't make it into the top tier journal? Where do you go with them? We have the Journal of Management, Spirituality, and Religion, but even we reject papers, you know. And how do we become higher up in the level or whatever? By rejecting more papers, right? How does the AOM look at the importance of, how many papers you reject? So the whole point is that the chances of your paper getting into a top tier journal are very small. And I still think there's a place for everybody to, there has to be a place for your article, even if it's not in the top tier journal. But I don't know if any of you have run into that. But if you send something to a top tier journal, the chances of it getting in are pretty slim. So I don't know if anyone has any thoughts on that.